Welcome back to the Talking Foreign Affairs podcast series. I'm your host, Adil Cader. In today's episode, we are pleased to be joined by Ian Bremmer, president and founder of the Eurasia Group. Many of you would know Ian from his contribution in political risk research and his famous G0 podcast. Many like myself, however, would know Ian for his viral thought-provoking LinkedIn posts that raise awareness on key global issues. If you haven't followed Ian's page on LinkedIn, I would highly recommend you do so. In fact, he was ranked by LinkedIn in the top 10 Voices influence list. For the next 30 minutes, we will be talking about Ian's latest book, also now a bestseller, The Power of Crisis: How Three Threats and Our Response Will Change the World. In the book, Ian draws lessons from global challenges of the past 100 years to show how we can respond to three great crises unfolding over the next decade. We will also be briefly talking about Ian's important reflections on current global issues. Ian Bremmer is a political scientist who helps business leaders, policymakers, and the general public make sense of the world around them. He's the president and founder of Eurasia Group, the world's leading political research, risk research, and consulting firm, and G0 Media, a company dedicated to providing intelligent and engaging coverage of international affairs. Ian is credited with bringing the craft of political risk to financial markets, creating Wall Street's first global political risk index, and for establishing political risk as an academic discipline. His definition of emerging markets has become an industry standard, G0. His term for a global power vacuum in which no country is willing and able to set the international agenda is widely used by policymakers and thought leaders. Ian is the author of 11 books and appears weekly on US national television through his show G0 World. He currently teaches at Columbia University. On that note, Ian, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, Dale. Happy to be with you.
Ian, to start off with, what made you want to write such a book?
Well, I mean, if you look at my books over the last 10 years, I've basically been addressing how the world order has been unwinding, fragmenting. That's the geopolitical thought behind my idea of a G0 world, where you don't have global leadership or capabilities. It is what I wrote about with the end of the free market, the rise of China as a state capitalist economy, leading to a global hybrid economy that we don't have institutions or architecture for. And it's also the idea behind us versus them, the failure of globalism, where I looked at how democratic institutions around the world were increasingly not fit for purpose and anti-establishment and populist trends were undermining them. Okay, well, that's a kind of a bummer long cycle over the last 10, 15 years. But the point is that if these institutions keep eroding, you start seeing all sorts of global crises that emerge. And it is in the seeds of those crises that you will have the new global order, such as it emerge. And that's ultimately a more hopeful frame. I mean, I don't like these crises any more than you do. It's not fun to live through a global pandemic. It's not fun to watch the Russians invade Ukraine. It's not fun to see global climate change get worse and worse every year. But the fact is that those are precisely the things that will shake us to actually reform and recreate institutions that are fit for the 21st century. So in that regard, this seemed like a very high time to write a more hopeful book.
You've used the term Goldilocks Crisis in the book. Can you just explain that more to our listeners?
A Goldilocks crisis is sort of the geopolitical equivalent of a human being in flow state, where we understand that if we're not challenged by our environments, we don't give our best. But if an environment is so challenging, a competitor is so tough that we've got no shot. I mean, if you're playing basketball against LeBron, you're not exactly going to try because it's demoralizing. Well, it turns out that there is such a thing as a Goldilocks crisis. You don't want crises to be too small that you ignore them. So, for example, gun violence in the United States for the past decade, or crack cocaine in the 80s and 90s that led to a lot of thoughts and prayers, a lot of performative political speeches, but no one willing to make a difference. But you don't want a crisis that's so big that, your institutions get destroyed and you don't feel capable of taking a response. And that's, of course, how World War I broke out. And I do believe that when we talk about the Russia-Ukraine invasion, or we talk about climate change in particular, both of these crises have strong aspects of a Goldilocks crisis for two reasons. First of all, I mean, aside from the fact that they're big enough to matter, also, there's really only one side. When the Russians invaded Ukraine, everyone in NATO, with the potential exception of Noam Chomsky and Tucker Carlson, not exactly a Wonder Twins combination, recognized that Putin was a very bad man and that we needed to do something about it. And furthermore, the farther that the crisis went on, the more your priors were confirmed, the more you realized, oh my God, look how tough these Ukrainians are. Look how much they're fighting. Look how courageous they are. Look at the war crimes being committed. Look at the rapes. Look at the torture. Look at the filtration camps of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians being sent to Russia. Like, we have to do something. Climate change is the same. Wasn't 20 years ago when people didn't care as much, but now that it's at a point that it really is starting to affect people around the world, there's only one side. Everyone in the world understands we've had 1.2 degrees centigrade of warming already. And everyone understands the farther this goes, the more it's impacting you. And so that creates elements of a Goldilocks crisis in these two very, very disturbing, I mean, driving more headlines than anything else these days in terms of things we're concerned about. And that should ultimately make us more hopeful.
So I know you in the book, you also mentioned that the pandemic wasn't big enough, not sort of fitting in that Goldilocks criteria. I'm just quite curious to know your reflections on the nuclear disarmament issue and where that would fit as a crisis.
Yeah. By the way, I would say the pandemic did have that Goldilocks crisis capacity in the early days when Fauci was lionized and the CDC was paid attention to, and Americans and others came together to make sure there was enough economic support, not just for big companies, but for average citizens. So you got a V-shaped recovery. But once you had vaccines, well, the Chinese, because of the effectiveness of their lockdown, and they got complacent, which is a real problem because you see they didn't vaccinate their people. And now 2 years later, they're having these massive zero COVID issues. But in the West, once we had vaccines, people basically said, the politics started driving it. And so it was whether you were red or blue that determined your response. And then, of course, it meant that you didn't have to care as much. So it became much less of a priority and other things intervened. So not a Goldilocks crisis. That's right. Nuclear proliferation. I think even though the Americans and the Soviets hated each other and wanted to destroy each other in many ways, we were trying to win. We wanted the end of the Soviet regime. So it was an ideological battle for global dominance. But we understood that nukes couldn't be used after using them twice in World War II. And so, first of all, we really did want to put effort in to engage in arms control with each other. And that describes the opening anecdote in the book where Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev get together for the first time in a dacha outside of Geneva, Switzerland. And Reagan asks Gorbachev, if aliens came down and attacked us, you'd defend us, wouldn't you? And Gorbachev said, sure, of course I would. And Reagan said, well, so would I, and so would we. And that ends up creating a backdrop for more effective arms control engagement. But it's not just about the US and the Soviets. It's also that we both recognized that we really didn't want proliferation. And 80 years later, the world did a pretty good job in preventing most rogue states and all non-state actors, terrorists, and the rest from acquiring nuclear capabilities. And of course, the last crisis I talk about in the book is that we now have these very different 21st century disruptive technologies, which have equal existential threats that they can pose to humanity. But so far, the Americans, the Russians, and the Chinese are doing nothing to try to identify those technologies and try to ensure that they don't proliferate. And of course, that's a very dangerous position to be in if I look 5-10 years down the road. So my book was really a call to action on that front.
You kind of perfectly went into my next question, which was about talking about the AI war. And I was going to ask you whether you would think this would mirror the sort of competition we had in the Cold War, specifically with initiatives like Belt and Road, tying into the US versus China rivalry.
Well, I mean, the difference between the US-Chinese rivalry with the Soviets, we had nuclear, world, what would you call it, mutually assured destruction. And that nuclear balance helped ensure that the Americans and the Soviets didn't fall into a hot war. Well, with the Chinese, we actually have massive economic interdependence of the type that we didn't have with the Soviets. And so much so, and so incredibly interconnected, that it helps to avoid or insulate us from a Cold War. So I do think the level of cooperation between the US and China, even though we don't trust each other, we don't talk about it much, turns out to be much deeper and much more resilient than what we had with the Soviets. So in principle, it should be much easier to facilitate the kind of cooperation that would allow us to put limits on things like lethal autonomous drones, on things like AI algorithms that would, create huge danger, disinformation and deep fakes and not knowing what's a person and what isn't. I mean, again, you imagine how that utilized by a terrorist organization could easily lead to the destruction of an economy or worse, or precipitate a war. We have very strong mutual interest in ensuring that that doesn't happen. And yet so far, the Americans and the Chinese aren't engaging in that, in part because these technologies have emerged much more quickly. So government actors are not as facile with understanding the nature of the danger. And also in part because it's not the governments that are doing a lot of the driving, it's technology companies themselves. In the digital space, in the virtual world, technology companies are actually as sovereign actors. And yet they don't have seats at the table when we talk about global architecture. So that's a big change too. And again, that doesn't make me feel like this is impossible to get right, but it does make me feel like we need to push this on the agenda much more urgently so that people are aware of the nature of the challenge.
So you spoke briefly there about governments and individuals at the table, and that goes into my next question is, you've previously said that institutions have been eroded. I'm just curious, you think that's just on a national level, but also internationally, like looking at international government organizations like the UN, the World Health Organization, the World Bank?
Yes, very clearly. I mean, when I think about climate change, first of all, the European Union is probably the most important actor that has been driving a response to transition post-fossil fuels in the world. The European Union is not a government. It's a supra-governmental institution. And yet it's incredibly important. Also in the United States, I could argue that the state governments of California and Florida and Texas have probably done more than the United States at a federal level to move the needle on climate change. And these are red states and blue states, doesn't really matter. The point is that they are following, they're driving economic incentives. And so are the financial institutions that are moving trillions of dollars away from thermal coal and from oil and gas and towards electric vehicles and nuclear power, advanced generations, as well as the supply chains and capacity to build out solar and wind, so much so that at scale, solar is now cheaper than coal. That's a really big deal. And it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the big banks and the corporations. The governments weren't doing the primary driving here. Now, once that money moves and once it becomes obvious that there's real momentum, it becomes easier for a lot of the central governments to come in. And of course, when we talk about the COP26 summit, we talk about net zero commitments, we talk about anti-deforestation. I mean, governments, of course, matter a lot. I'm not trying to say they don't, but certainly no one would argue that governments are the only principal actors in responding to global climate change today. And in fact, even when you talk about Russia, Ukraine, here's an interesting one, Adil. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, the land invasion was on February 24th. But the war started on the 23rd when the Russians used cyber attacks against Ukraine. And that wasn't experienced in Ukraine. It was experienced in Washington, in Seattle, Washington, because Microsoft was running those servers for the Ukrainian government. So Microsoft was literally a belligerent in the fight against Russia before NATO was. And that's because technology companies are fundamentally in control when we talk about a lot of the digital world. And you see that with Elon Musk's SpaceX standing up Starlink that prevents the Russians from shutting down Ukrainian communications. You see it with Google and the role of YouTube and allowing Russians to have access to information that otherwise has been cut off by just about everybody. So, I mean, this is enormously important and fundamentally different in how we think about a global order and global architecture from, say, after World War II, when we were really just talking about central governments.
I really find that quite fascinating because I focus me a lot on multi-track diplomacy, looking just beyond the government to government level. And kind of as a follow-up question, I've got to ask you, do you think this model of the UN, the GA, where all it's just a heads of state meeting, there needs to be some sort of reform of these international government bodies to ensure that some of these civil society voices, like technology companies, um, young leaders, have the same voting powers as the heads of states?
Well, I think that new institutions that are created will need to take into account the fact that they will be fundamentally multi-stakeholder. Now, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, is a United Nations body, but it's a multi-stakeholder United Nations body that brings together different voices from 195 countries that basically put out the state of play of global science on climate every year. And we all now agree exactly where we are. There's no more fake news around climate. There may be a lot of countries that don't want to spend the money, that have a different view of resource allocation and equity and fairness and justice, or priorities. But the fact is that you can't fix a problem, you can't respond to a crisis unless you agree what it is. And the fact is a multi-stakeholder approach has gotten us there in the confines of the United Nations. So, I mean, I would argue if you want to expand NATO to be 21st century, yeah, you'd need technology companies to have a seat at the table when you're talking about anything involving cyber. That's new. That's not the way that NATO works right now, but it needs to change. And certainly if I were to think about creating an international framework in responding to disruptive technologies, I would say that technology companies will be absolutely critical in that creation of that architecture, no question.
Just moving on to specifically the Ukraine crisis, on one of your previous G0 podcasts, you talk about how for the Ukraine invasion, it's the end of globalization for Russia. Do you think there's any way back for Russia?
I don't think there's any easy way back for Russia. I don't think there's any plausible near-term way back for Russia. That's one of the reasons I'm so negative about the outcome of this crisis on the European continent. Is that I can't see any scenario where Russia doesn't end up in a materially worse economic, geopolitical, and geostrategic position than it would have been if it hadn't invaded on February 24th. I think that once the Europeans cut off energy from Russia, they will have diversified. They're not going to go back. And I don't think that the freezing of Russia's assets and the sanctions that have been put on, which are the toughest sanctions that have ever been put on a G20 economy. I mean, by a long margin, the only way you could unwind those sanctions, short of the West just capitulating, which I don't see happening, would be if the Russians were to fully remove their troops from occupied Ukraine. Let's leave aside Crimea, but certainly everything in the Donbass and the land bridge. I just can't see that happening. I mean, either under Putin or even under a successor leader. So I just think that the circles on the Venn diagram don't overlap to get you a climb down. So that basically the Russian invasion created a permanent decoupling of Russia from the advanced industrial economies, not from the world. They're not an international pariah. They're not becoming North Korea. Lots of countries will still do business with them. But, cutting Russia off from Europe, where Russia's economy was oriented towards Europe, their infrastructure, their population. I mean, Russia fundamentally was doing more with Europe than anyone else. Cutting that off is going to have enormously severe consequences for Russia, medium to long term.
So you did mention a lot about how the relationships with Europe will be deteriorated. And that sort of goes into my next question. There are still a lot of countries in Asia that aren't willing to that aren't willing to stop their relationships with Russia, not willing to sanction them, not willing to condemn them. Do you think this still would help with Russian globalization, or do you think there'll be more pressure over time for these countries to fall in line, similar to what we saw with apartheid South Africa?
No, I don't think it's about falling in line. These are poor countries. They need food. They are not going to allow their citizens to starve. They'll buy from anyone to ensure that. They need energy. The Indians are, nominally strategically aligned with the United States, but they're buying more oil from Russia today than they were before the invasion. The Chinese are going to be the largest economy in the world. They've stepped up the oil purchases too. They're not going to directly break Western sanctions because they don't want to be caught in those sanctions themselves. But leaving that aside, when you talk about basic commodities, no, it's a global market. The Russians will continue to export. Having said that, the Russians were the second largest arms exporter in the world. And in order to export arms, you need an effective manufacturing sector. You need to be able to guarantee spare parts. They won't be able to do that. So that's going to fall apart. A lot of their economy relied on Western technologies, Western semiconductors. They're not going to have those either going forward. So I do think when I look at Iran, over 10 years of sanctions, their economy actually collapsed by some 50, 60%. Russia's GDP will contract by 10 to 15% this year on the back of these sanctions. It's going to get much worse going forward. And I think that that's going to make Russia angry at the West. And it's also going to create some level of political instability over 3 to 5 years domestically inside Russia.
We're just approaching time now, so we'll head into our last question. It's sort of a general strategic question based on what we've spoken about. So we've seen the rise of China, we've seen Russia, and as you have mentioned, you don't think Russia will come up well at the end of this conflict. I know you've spoken a lot about that. We don't live in a unipolar world. Essentially, once this Ukraine crisis is over and your predictions for the future of China, how do you think these two countries will impact in the global power balance?
I think that, as I mentioned, the United States and China are incredibly interdependent, and that is going to continue going forward. And so no matter how much you may dislike each other, there are very strong entrenched forces in both countries that will do everything they can to ensure that you don't have a permanent decoupling. There is a decoupling going on in some aspects of the economy, particularly in areas that are considered important for national security, and those are defined somewhat differently by the Americans and the Chinese. So that's an issue. Also, the fact that the Americans and the Europeans no longer need low-cost labor the way they did 30, 40 years ago in services and in manufacturing, given big data and deep learning in AI, given robotics and automation in manufacturing processes. And of course, China did manage to become the juggernaut internationally it is because they had this extraordinary amount of efficient, low-cost labor that advanced industrial democracies were willing to move their manufacturing processes to China, export them there, even at the expense of hollowing out their own middle classes where they were based. That obviously is changing. And as that changes, it will lead to more inshoring, onshoring, friendshoring, and that will also create more decoupling between the US and China. So I do think that if the level of interdependence is what prevents you from having a Cold War, if you project over the next 10 years, the buffer that interlinkage has provided you is likely to erode over time, but not so much or so quickly that China announcing that they're friends without limits with Russia suddenly leads them to say, okay, we're all in for the Russians. No, when the Americans warned the Russians, don't you dare, when the Americans warned the Chinese, don't you dare provide them military support, don't break our sanctions, the Chinese actually listened. And when they call the Europeans, they tell them, look, this war is bad for both of us. We need it to be over. They don't want to be tarred with the same brush that Putin has been tarred with. And that's because the Russian economy is 1/10 the size of China's, and they still do most of their business with the Europeans, with the Americans, and with others. And I think that ultimately is a stabilizing force.
So we have time for one more question. We got one question submitted to do with the J curve. Okay. So this person sent, listening to an interview you did with cafe.com recently, there was an interesting point raised on the US-China relationship and how you mentioned it in the book. You said that, quote, the US-China relationship is getting worse. And while the United States is by far the most politically dysfunctional and divided of the world's advanced democracies, China is by far the most cohesive and functional of the world's major authoritarian regimes.
Yeah.
Quite keen to get your view on the connection between this and your famous J-curve theory.
It's dangerous because when I wrote the J-curve, I basically said that some countries are stable because they're open, some are stable because they're closed, and in between you get great instability. But countries that are stable because they're open are ultimately more stable than countries that are stable because they're closed. And one reason for that, not the only one, but one reason for that, I mean, some of it's human spirit and, the ability to actually be more efficient around an open system and create more growth. But some of it is because technology, when I wrote the book, The J Curve, which was back in 2006, so 16 years ago, technology was actually supporting democracy, the communications revolution, and undermined authoritarian states. And the more technology you had, the more people were able to get information of what was happening outside their country anonymously. If you're on the internet, no one knows if you're a dog. I mean, you remember that famous cartoon, all that kind of stuff. But today, the technology revolution is about data and surveillance. It's not bottom up, it's top down. And increasingly, the proliferation of new algorithms and the ability to use them to drive outcomes, both economic and political, actually supports the consolidation of authoritarian regimes and deeply undermines civil societies in democratic countries, which means there is a trend to flip, by technology, to flip the J curve on its axis, which means that technologically empowered authoritarian states may end up being more consolidated and stable than advanced industrial democracies. If that's true, if that trend continues, and there's no guarantee it will. I mean, for example, the blockchain and the ability of individuals to suddenly wrest control of all of their data could completely subvert it and move it back in the other direction. But if present trends continue, you could see a system where the Chinese actually have the governing model that lots of countries around the world aspire to because it's considered more politically stable, and that the American political system and maybe other democracies too start to truly fragment on the back of these advanced technologies.
Ian, thank you so much for being generous with your time. We really appreciate your reflections. To our listeners, Ian Cader's book is available in our video description. Please feel free to go and get it. Thank you.
Thanks, Adil. Good talking to you.